Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the 10th section in Unit 7. And in this section, we're going to talk about something called isolating mechanisms. Remember, up until this point, we've been talking about how different types of selection can change a species. And sometimes a group of organisms will become a new species, which is called speciation. In this section, we're going to talk about how different types of isolating mechanisms can achieve that goal of speciation. The first group of isolating mechanisms that we're going to talk about are called prezygotic isolating mechanisms. This just prevents the reproductive event from occurring. Our first example is habitat isolation, where different groups of organisms or different species just live in different areas. So these different species of giraffes in our example live in different areas, which would stop reproduction from occurring. Our next type of isolating mechanism is called temporal or temporal isolation. This is when different groups of organisms are going to have different reproductive times when they go through reproduction. So the example here are these different frogs having different time periods when they go through reproduction. So since they have different time periods, a leopard frog isn't going to be able to mate with a green frog because they are mating at different time periods throughout the year. Our next type of isolating mechanism is called behavioral isolation, and this is when different species don't recognize each other because of their mating ritual or just behaviors. For example, different bird species have different behavioral or mating rituals, which would only be attractive to groups within their own species. Our next type of isolation is a little bit awkward. All I like to say about this one is sometimes things just don't fit together. For whatever reason, the genitalia of certain organisms just don't work together, if that makes sense. Our last type of prezygotic isolating mechanism is known as gametic isolation. And for whatever reason, this is when the sperm just won't penetrate the egg of another species. Everything else seems like it would work, but just for whatever reason, the sperm and egg just don't interact and they just don't work together. The example here, these two sea urchins live in the same environment, have the same mating time. Everything seems like it would work, but for whatever reason, the sperm and egg just don't fuse together. The next group of isolating mechanisms are known as post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. And this is after reproduction has been successful. However, for some reason, the zygote just doesn't develop correctly. Our first example is like the mule coming from the horse and donkey, where it's a hybrid. It's a combination of these two organisms or species, but it's sterile. It just doesn't reproduce. It's unable to further on that line. The next example here is when the zygote or the embryo of the offspring dies early on in development. So these two organisms from two different species or groups of organisms would mate and produce a zygote, but that zygote just dies early on in the development and doesn't produce a fertile offspring. Our last type is when the hybrid of two species develops, however, they fail to produce any viable offspring. As you can see here, again, the hybrids between these two groups of organisms are produced, but they just can't produce, again, fertile offspring.